Chapter 18 Golden Hill and Lexington. The shouts of gratitude to King George had scarcely died away in Bowling Green and on the Common when the wary merchant citizens discovered a fresh grievance. While the Stamp Act had been repealed by the English government, an equally offensive Mutiny Act had been passed, throwing upon New York the full cost of the soldiers' upkeep. Indignation flamed anew, nor was this evidence of a fickle spirit. The very steadfastness with which the little city on the shore of a vast continent was clinging to its standards of freedom had turned gratitude into rage. King George's statue in Bowling Green became a detested object, and the Liberty Pole on the Common a symbol of smoldering ill will between the populace and the soldiers. 4 times the Sons of Liberty raised its wooden shaft, and 4 times the soldiers cut it down. Then, in 1767, Parliament passed the Townsend's Act, which deprived the New York Assembly of legislative power and imposed duties on all imports. The Assembly defied Parliament. It continued to meet. The enterprising Samuel Francis had purchased Étienne de Lancy's fine mansion on the southeast corner of Broad and Dock, or Pearl, Streets in 1762, fitting it up as the Queen's Head Tavern, and now its great upper room became the scene of important public happenings. A group of the same harassed but determined merchants who had resisted the Stamp Act met there in 1768 to form the first Chamber of Commerce, with John Kruger as president. They numbered among them such sugar refiners, ship chandlers, and importers as Isaac Roosevelt, John Alsop, Isaac Lowe, members of the Ludlow family from Brooklyn Heights, the Bocks, the Franklins, and the Schermerhorns. However, when these merchants voted to submit to all import duties except the tax on tea, the Sons of Liberty, who represented the working classes, protested vigorously against their action. A first skirmish between the Sons of Liberty and the soldiers took place on August 11, 1766, but what has more justly been called the First Battle of the Revolution, with bloodshed on both sides, occurred in New York on 1770. In that year, the British soldiers, for the 5th time, cut down the Liberty Pole and began tacking up taunting placards around the town. Isaac Sears and 2 others came upon some of the garrison at this work, and blows were exchanged. Presently, 20 soldiers arrived on the scene. A mob of 3,000 gathered, and the storm broke. The townspeople, armed with knives and clubs, beat back the soldiers as far as Golden Hill, on John Street near Cliff, where the intervention of officers sent them back to the barracks and restored order. A few years of comparative quiet followed, and though business was dull and poverty spreading, life in New York seemed to go on much as before the disturbances. Roger Morris had built the mansion, famous to this day as the Morris House, or Jumel Mansion, and had wedded the beautiful Mary Phillips, once courted in her father's home in Yonkers by Washington. The New York Hospital was erected by public subscription. In the Presbyterian brick church on Beekman Street, the celebrated Jonathan Edwards came to preach for a short time. The first milestones set up in the city were placed in 1769, measuring the City Hall at the corner of Wall and Nassau Streets, northward along the Bowery and Kingsbridge roads. At the present 181st Street and Broadway, the famous Blue Bell Tavern opened its doors to weary travelers. Suddenly, the packets from London brought news that England meant to force her colonies to pay the tea tax. All of the old, slumbering resentment flamed high once more. The Sons of Liberty reorganized, and an assembly of citizens met and voted to send back any tea ships that arrived. The first one came just as the vessel bearing the unpopular Governor Tryon off for a holiday in England disappeared on the horizon, and Lieutenant Governor Colden wrung his hands while the citizens ordered the tea ships to face about and depart, to the accompaniment of much defiant parading and firing of cannon. Boston had held her Tea Party in the meanwhile, and when Parliament's Act closing the port of Boston in reprisal was made known in New York, sympathetic indignation went further than words. A committee of 51, with Isaac Low as chairman, sent out a call for the First Continental Congress, representing all the colonies, to meet in Philadelphia. Each delegate that passed through the city, en route to the momentous convention, was enthusiastically greeted, and John Jay of New York, one of the representatives chosen by the 51, drafted the Declaration of Rights, which the Congress adopted. The Committee of 51 was continued as a Committee of 60 to keep watch over the threatened liberty of New York, and when the regular assembly, by a small majority, failed to sanction the Continental Congress, the 60 took a private vote of the city and sent their own representatives to the Second Continental Congress. The assembly had not represented the true temper of the people and dissolved. From this moment, exciting events followed one another rapidly. The 17-year-old King's College student, Alexander Hamilton, made a stirring speech on the Common in behalf of representation. On one quiet Sunday noon, a foam-covered horse clattered into Broadway from the Bowery, bringing a rider with news of the Battle of Lexington. The Liberty Boys rushed at once to the City Hall and seized 600 muskets stored there for the militia. When British troops from the upper barracks were ordered a few days later to embark on board the Asia, Colonel Marinus Willett hastened to be on hand with his comrades of the Sons of Liberty. In Broad Street, he himself stopped the front horses of their ammunition carts and drove off with the supplies, to the consternation of the British commander. A provincial congress, called in New York by the committee, was increased to 100, and a secret commission of safety was appointed, which functioned throughout the war, often making its headquarters at the old Christopher House, now standing in Willowbrook, Staten Island. A state of war was recognized by the Continental Congress, and George Washington was made Commander-in-Chief of the Army, with orders to proceed to Boston. Over on Long Island, Toryism was rife, and a force was sent to disarm the inhabitants. Not all of that territory was opposed to war, however, for Nathaniel Woodhull of Mastic was elected president of the Provincial Assembly, which gave Washington a vociferous welcome as he passed through New York. A cooler reception was accorded the returning Governor Tryon that same day, and he soon thought it prudent to retire to a frigate in the harbor. After the defeat of the British in Boston, Washington made New York his headquarters, living at first in the De Peyster House in Pearl Street, opposite Cedar. It was then that his attention was called to a youthful artillery captain, whom General Greene had watched drilling his men on the Common. This was Alexander Hamilton, destined to become Washington's most valuable aide at a later period of the war. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Second Continental Congress completed the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. New York was in a frenzied state of preparation when a copy of that document arrived on the 9th, and Washington ordered it read to the soldiers, drawn up in brigade formation about the Common. The wildest enthusiasm followed. Cries of joy, gunshots, caps, flags filled the air, and mobs rushed forth to Bowling Green to tear down the leaden statue of King George, later melted into good American bullets. Then, on the 22nd day of August, Lord Howe landed his troops on Long Island, and New York passed from an era of documents and speeches into the reality of war.